Well, hello, and welcome to Insight with Political Tours, the travel company led by reporters around the world. My name is Owen Bennett-Jones, sitting in for Nicholas Wood today, and we're discussing Hungary and why it matters so much. And we really could not have a better guide than Nick Thorpe, who has covered the country. I was trying to work it out, Nick, so I think we first met during the Romanian Revolution, probably, or shortly thereafter, and you've basically been there ever since. So it is well over 30 years that you've been covering.
40. It'll be 40 years next February.
Gosh. Okay. So I mean, you
feel very old.
You are genuinely the expert on this, and I mean, one of the amazing things about your time there is that you've known Viktor Orban, this very important European figure now, really standing for a certain type of politics in Europe. You've known him right since the beginning. So we'll just have a bit about Orban first off, and then get on to where we are now with elections and Europe and so on. So just, you've known Orban from the start. What has been his political development? From what to what?
In a nutshell, Viktor Orban went from a young student leader to a tough sovereigntist, national conservative. He doesn't even shy away from the word nationalist, so long as nationalist is used in a positive sense. So he's been in power now for 15 years. He's won 4 consecutive election victories. And at a time when one looks around Europe at how weak the French government is, how weak the German government is, how battered the British government is, Viktor Orban sort of radiates this confidence as a strong politician at a time of great turmoil in the world. And of course, thanks to, or rather, since Donald Trump was re-elected in the United States, he feels he has a sort of giant at his shoulder because he's cultivated that friendship, not only with Trump, but with J.D. Vance, with the MAGA Republicans. He described himself recently as a mouse crossing a bridge. Hungary as a mouse crossing a bridge, but now we've got an elephant at our side.
But that's interesting he calls himself a mouse, because I was going to ask you about this, that I read something, just preparing for this, read something saying that he wishes he was from a bigger country, because then he'd be more important.
That's true. On the other hand, one of his achievements has been to put Hungary on the map and put himself on the map. Who would have thought a few years ago that a Hungarian leader, only a few years ago, could be known around the world, in South America, in North America, in different African countries, across the Middle East. So, many people hate him, many people love him, but he's certainly become a sort of a lighthouse, a beacon of some kind. And he's put his small country of 9.7 million people and himself very much on the map.
And one thing which just illustrates, and then we'll move on to some of the current political issues. One thing that illustrates his political development is that he was, amazingly, I didn't realize this, again, reading for this, that he was paid for by Soros, that George Soros paid for him to go to Oxford University and basically learn liberal democracy, if you like. And then he turned on Soros and made him the hate figure that he is in America, too, for the right. So just tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, this is quite an interesting development. So Orban very much began as a liberal, even a libertarian politician in the early 1990s, late 80s, early 1990s. But as that space appeared when the then central, or rather centre-right government collapsed, the Hungarian Democratic Forum, effectively in 1994, Orban sort of dragged his own Liberal Party, junior Liberal Party, kicking and screaming to the right of the spectrum, simply because that was where the space opened up. In terms of the political opportunity, really, that was what Hungary was lacking, a centre-right party. Since then, he's moved it a lot further to the right. Even until 2010, he got on relatively well with George Soros as a philanthropist. Really, he put a lot of energy and time and money into creating an open society after the collapse of communism. But then, as Orban moved away from that idea of consensual politics to what he calls majoritarian government. In other words, the winner takes all. The winner, as he has done since 2010, reshapes the country, the society in his own image and that of his own party, of its own ideology, an increasingly right-wing ideology. Then Soros really was not just a sort of an ideological critic, but Soros became a useful enemy for Orban, because I suppose, as any populist politician, if we can use that word, populists need enemies. And since 2013, Soros then was he was a useful enemy because he couldn't really fight back. He didn't have a political party of his own. He didn't even have a voice of his own, really. So he was identified as the person who represented a kind of rootless cosmopolitan world against the idea of a strong traditional family, a strong nation, a strong sovereignty. And therefore he was, and especially in 2015 when the migration crisis, so-called migration crisis, came up, Soros gave one speech suggesting Europe might wish to take on 1 million people from the Middle East and beyond a year. And that gave Orban a kind of point at which he can attack him every time.
Rootless cosmopolitan. That's a phrase that has a slightly anti-Semitic tinge.
It does. It's not one that Orban uses. I use it here slightly ironically. This was a potential problem for Orban, who he didn't want to be seen to be in any sense an anti-Semitic figure. One of the ways, and by targeting Soros, that did open him to that possibility. One of the ways he's very skillfully dodged that is to cultivate his own friendship with Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel, and to be within the EU, probably Israel's strongest, or one of Israel's strongest allies. Anything on Gaza, Orban will not accept any criticism of what Israel's doing in Gaza, for example, now. So it's that knocks away pretty easily, pretty swiftly, any accusation of anti-Semitism, against this government, against Orban.
Just to say, if people would like to ask a question of Nick, then please do that. You can raise your hand digitally. You can put something in the chat box or the chat section, and we can, if you'd like, promote you to the point where you can make comments visually, and so we can get your contribution that way. So if anyone does have anything to ask, please do start making yourself noticed in any of those ways. Now then, there are elections next year, and you've already mentioned 4 wins, and big wins, right? I mean, he's phenomenally successful electorally. Take us through just the brief history of those wins. How did he do it?
2010, when he bounced back to power, he had an earlier time in power in 1998 to 2002. He was out of power for 8 years, but he used those 8 years very skillfully, building his party structure, building its finances, building an economic background to it. And then 2008, 2009 global economic crisis, that really damaged the then socialist liberal coalition. He won a landslide in 2010, and since then he's won with a mixture of good luck and skill, I suppose. He put the economy back on its feet. He got rid of the IMF loan. He paid back the IMF loan. He benefited from Hungary's strong relationship with the German economy. Hungary has a very open economy. It has, I think, 300,000 jobs dependent on German car manufacturing in this country. Since in the late teens, early 2020s, he's brought in a lot of Chinese investment. In the meantime, he's had this opening to the east. He's brought in, he's blessed with, for a time at least, relatively cheap Russian oil, gas, and nuclear elements for Hungary's nuclear power station. So he's played all of those, and he's he's had some good fortune about the strength of the German economy. Of course, that is now, because of the downturn in Germany and so on, now the economy, the Hungarian economy is in trouble, partly because of all the trouble other European and especially German economies are in.
Just before we get on to this next election, then, I just got a question that's come in, and it sort of touches on some of what you said there. What is Orban's view of Ukraine? Where does he stand on that conflict?
This is very important because back in '89, Orban came to fame. His first claim to fame, he burst onto the scene when he said that Hungary should ask for Soviet troops to be withdrawn. This was back in June '89. So for a long time, he, like other Hungarian politicians, was very anti-Russian, one should say. That changed in 2009 when he attended in St. Petersburg a congress of Putin's party, and suddenly overnight, effectively, Orban started cozying up to Vladimir Putin. And since that time, Hungary has argued for what his government calls realpolitik. Friendship with everyone, openness to the world, connectivity, not doing well in the world of blocs. And therefore, when the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine took place in February 2022, Orban was pretty wishy-washy about condemning that. Though he speaks a lot about Hungarian sovereignty, he seems to regard Ukraine as a kind of buffer state. He doesn't like to talk much about Ukrainian sovereignty or Ukrainians' right to defend its own sovereignty from Russia. And therefore, even though he has signed up to the 18 packages of sanctions from the EU, he's done that in a very critical way. He says sanctions never get anywhere. We need good relations with Russia. His foreign minister, Peter Szijjártó, is a regular visitor to Moscow, and Hungary has defied EU calls to wean different EU economies off Russian oil and gas, and has continued to be. It even increased its dependence on Russian oil last year, I think, from around 60 up to close to 80%.
Yes, I heard him say something quite interesting the other day about Russia, and when people were saying to him, "Look, you're not taking care of the fact that Russia is on the offensive, that there could be other countries, Moldova or wherever, could be affected next," and he just said, "Get serious. Europe's much bigger than Russia. It's not a problem. We could always beat Russia." So he sort of plays both sides.
He does play both sides. And of course, Hungary is still in NATO as well as in the EU. Hungarian pilots fly Saab Gripen planes in NATO air policing missions over the Baltic Sea, over the Black Sea. So this is, again, one of the keys to his success. He's not on one side or the other. He's trying to be. There's a poem from Endre Ody, one of Hungary's best, possibly Hungary's best 20th century poet, called Kompország, ferry country, constantly moving like a sort of a river ferry across the river between the eastern shore and the western shore. The poet, Ody, made this as a criticism that Hungary sort of lost between the two sides. Orban, in a way, is talking about it as an advantage, that he can do that. He can still keep on good relations with the Russians.
The question came from Harold. Does that answer your question, or have you got a supplementary?
No, thank you very much. That was very helpful. I've got another question.
Go for it.
Another question. As the excellent speaker said, there's a strong streak of nationalism, if not worse, as it were, in Hungary. But I think this is to be explained by Hungary's history. Would the speaker like to go into that a bit?
Yes. I mean, I think one of the mistakes that many Western commentators made in 1989 was to depict the fall of communism as a kind of victory of capitalism over communism. And many commentators, I think, neglected or ignored the strong national patriotic element of 1989, of all those revolutions in East Germany, in Czechoslovakia, in Hungary, in Romania, that these were revolutions, people coming onto the street, reclaiming their national identity, which they felt had been suppressed by in socialist, communist internationalism. And that, of course, we saw that it had bloody consequences, especially in Yugoslavia, with the falling apart of Yugoslavia, but right through to the present day, and especially in bringing this, fast forward to the 2020s, Orban. Again, many people in the West seem to misunderstand Orban. They imagined he was a kind of Eurosceptic and would like to sort of Hunksit, to take Hungary after Brexit. This might be the latest of European politicians who wanted to take their country out of the EU. Far from it. Orban is keen, and Hungarians, you get 75, 80% of the population here saying they want to stay in the EU. But what Orban talks about is occupying Brussels. Reshaping the EU from the inside through backing alliances with other right-wing parties. Marine Le Pen in France, the AfD in Germany, Andrej Babiš, who's just won the Czech elections, different politicians across the region to create a Europe of the nations. And so very much that Europe should not be any kind of federal union. The EU should not be a federal union, but rather a Europe of nations with very little power at the centre. Of course, Hungary lost an ally in Britain in this, when Britain left, rather than wanting a sort of deeper integration of the EU, Hungary, as Britain in the old days, was rather in favour of a shallow integration and sort of strong sovereign nations.
Yeah, but the thing about Britain was it was paying money in. I mean, that was a big part of the Brexit campaign. Hungary's taking a lot of money out, So it would seem to me that from what you're saying, he wants a Europe that gives him the billions that have been flowing to Hungary, many, many billions, even tens of billions that have been flowing to Hungary, and not to get any in, just to be allowed to not integrate into Europe at all.
Hungary was indeed, Owen, getting about 4 billion euros a year until Europe turned off the tap, because there is now, since 2022, conditionality mechanism tying the payout of those funds to rule of law, Hungary respecting, on a practical level, respecting an independent judiciary, respecting freedom of the press, and of course, not being corrupt. So there have been different efforts which have now succeeded in blocking large amounts of EU funds, and that is damaging. There's a shortfall. You can really feel that here at the moment. That money is now missing, and even though Orban says we don't need that money, we'll find it from somewhere else. We'll bring in Chinese investment, and they have been very successful in bringing in Chinese investment, but that money too comes with strings attached, and we don't necessarily see those strings yet. But he portrays his country, his government portrays this country as a medium-sized country which is now pulling its weight in Europe and trying to reshape Europe in its own image, and that sooner or later the EU is duty-bound legally to pay that money. That's what Orban at least tells his own population.
But so is it too much to say that there is a consistency in his apparently utterly contradictory political development from democratic champion to autocrat? But there may be a consistency in resisting Moscow and resisting Brussels. Yeah, he's just for Hungary.
He loves resisting. He's a man who likes a fight. And the more he's attacked, especially from the left or the liberal side, the more he relishes that. The image I have of him sometimes is as of a sort of martial arts fighter that in judo or different martial arts, when one's attacked, if one's nimble and deft enough, one sort of turns an attack into an attack of your own, and you floor. Yeah, exactly. You floor your opponent. And this is really Orban. And when you think about it, he's been doing this since 1988. So he's now had, 38 years of practice. So he is much more, he's got much more political experience than any of the people, since Merkel left the political scene in Germany, than any of the people he's up against. So he's a master tactician.
I think Harold has another question for us, and I'll just preface it by saying, let's think about the next elections then. He's had these 4 big wins, and you're saying European money's drying up, people are feeling it. That must be a bit of an election issue, I presume, and that must be worrying him, or tell me if it isn't. And Harold, would you like to come in with any more on that?
No, my last question was answered about the roots of Hungarian nationalism, really. I was happy with the answer. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thanks, Ron. I'm just seeing something here saying, how has the most recent clash with Brussels played out at home? So how is the European issue playing out in the polls and in the run up to the election?
We have now, since February last year, so February 2024, we have now an unusual development in Hungarian politics, which is the emergence of a strong challenger. One of the reasons Orban has been so successful in the last 15 years is he decimated the opposition in 2010, and they never really recovered. They were divided, they were weak, and they were pretty ineffectual. What we've had for the last 18 months is a new politician, Péter Magyar, in his early 40s, so 20 years younger than Viktor Orban, a very energetic, very skillful at using social media in particular, touring the country constantly, calling out Orban and setting his own agenda, which Fidesz has to reply to. Orban's party, Fidesz, has to reply to. So we now are going into the April 2026 elections with Orban having a real battle on his hands. Péter Magyar has joined, and his new Tisza party, which is named after Hungary's second river, the River Tisza, he's joined the European People's Party in Brussels. So he's very much a centre-right politician, but also strongly talking about a Hungarian national identity. But he accuses Orban of being corrupt, of stealing the country, of taking over the state, and of basically taking Hungary out of the European mainstream. So Péter Magyar's, one of his strongest selling points is, we will return Hungary to the European mainstream, and I will bring home the missing funds which have been suspended, on which our economy, you, the taxpayers, badly need. So this is one of his strongest points, and he's kind of mesmerized the Hungarian population. In some ways, he reminds me of the young Orban, Peter.
Really? And if you look to the polls now, where would they stand, Orban, Magyar?
The most opinion polls put the Tisza party and Péter Magyar ahead.
Narrowly.
From 5 to 15%.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So not just narrowly ahead, but there are polls that have been done by pro-government, pro-Fidesz agencies who say this is nonsense, and that they're confident that they're still in the lead. So huge disparities in that polling data. And of course, we've still got the campaign has already begun. Campaigns ought to be 30 days or so. Our campaign has been going on here for a long time, and it's very rough, very bitter already. The language being used is, some people are worried about violence here simply because the verbal violence is already such a pitch of intensity.
Right. I'll be going to Jennifer, who's got a question in a moment, but just since you are talking about the election, can you tell us about the tour that you are organising, 4 political tours next year? I think it's just before the election, right?
That's right. This is early March, and I was a little nervous about accepting this invitation because it's so close to the actual vote.
Well, you've got to do your work.
I have to work as well, and it'll be good to explain all this. One can sometimes get lost in the detail, and one of the things I enjoy so much about doing these tours is that, to talk to people who are passionately interested in the country, but perhaps haven't been here as long as I have. So we would start in Budapest, obviously in the capital. We would travel we like to involve a big provincial element, countryside cities in this. So we would go to Debrecen. Debrecen is the sort of is a Protestant town in a largely Catholic country. There's a strong Protestant work ethic. It was an agricultural centre, but now it's the centre of new investment. So just on the ring road around Debrecen, we have a giant CATL Chinese battery factory, which is supposed to start work later this year, early next year. We have South Korean factories. There's a new BMW factory. So many new factories are popping up around that city. They're worried, firstly, about where they're going to find all the laborers to build these factories and then to work there, and also about the impact on water supplies in that very parched, dry flatlands of eastern Hungary. So we'll go to Debrecen, then we'll go to Tokaj, which of course is famous for its wines. It's an agricultural centre, and there it'll be more. This is an area which is traditionally very strongly pro-Fidesz, pro-Orban. But now, because it's close to the River Tisza, and the opposition party is named after that river, but not only for that reason, but it's an interesting kind of aspect of all of this. Peter Magyar and the new party have been working very hard on what have always been Orban's kind of heartlands, the villages, the small provincial towns, to give themselves a chance. So we'll get those elements, the urban elements in the provinces, the rural elements in the province, and of course some very solid speakers and tour and exploration of the beautiful Hungarian capital astride the River Danube.
Yes, and hopefully an idea of which way the election's going to go. Jennifer, your question.
Yes, you hinted at this a bit, I guess, with the people you'll speak to on the tour, but I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about what this practically means for Hungarians, especially for how long you've lived there, with a new politician coming in. And you mentioned Orban's a master tactician. Like, how long can somebody maintain that fight on all sides? And in a world that seems like you have to start choosing sides, I'm wondering what you're hearing from Hungarians on the ground, practically in their daily lives, what this is starting to look like.
Thanks, Jennifer. Yes, no, it's a good question. I think a lot of Hungarians are fed up with Orban. I wouldn't dare to predict the result, even though the opinion polls give the opposition party a pretty solid lead at the moment. But there is a lot of anger with corruption in the country. Inevitably, after 15 years in power, many of Viktor Orban's slogans sound somewhat stale, especially on the war in Ukraine, his previous criticism of migrants, keeping migrants out of Europe. No one's coming here anymore. No one really wanted ever to settle in Hungary in large numbers. But they did want to cross Hungary. Hungary has a large fence on its southern border. But when Hungarians no longer see migrants, it's hard to think of a migrant as a threat. The war in Ukraine is that big issue. So I think the country really is very, very polarized. Whole families are polarized. There's a sort of, in a typical Hungarian election, you need 3 million votes to win. There's normally about a 5 million, 5.3, 5.5 million people vote. So to win big, you need 3 million votes. At the moment, the polls suggest that Fidesz, Orban's party, have a core of 2 million voters, that the new party, Peter Magyar and Tisza party, have built up in just a year from nowhere, really, thanks to this dissatisfaction with a stagnant economy, people's worried about their standard of living because they're fed up with local as well as national corruption. And because of the skills of Peter Magyar as an energetic 43-year-old, constantly touring the country, going to places the opposition never got to before, villages and towns, and mesmerizing people. He's a very good public speaker. He has a mind, a sort of photographic memory. I went on tour with him last year. You're sitting in the back of a car with him, driving to the next rally, and his assistant, or his own ChatGPT, skimming through all the facts about, the village that he's about to give a speech at. He doesn't take notes. 5 minutes later, he's up on stage with 500 people in a small town or large village, and he's talking, and he's already processed the information his assistant's given him a few minutes ago into about 4 bullet points, and with this very strong delivery. So it's. He's a new character we haven't seen before, and he's answering the needs of many Hungarians who in the past either didn't go to vote or held their noses and voted for Orban because they felt there was nothing better. And at least in a time of crisis, and as I said at the beginning, this is Orban's probably biggest strength going into this election, he's a sort of father figure. He's emerged as a father figure to the nation. And one other point on this, Hungary has a tradition of single party rule, not just during the communist time, but through much of the 20th century. There was always one big party and lots of others fighting for the crumbs. And since 1989, and especially since, Orban really became such a power in the land, for most of the last 15 years, again, it's been a one-party state. So Hungarians are used to that, and they kind of like it in a way, because unlike other countries with coalition governments, we've never had a time when a government since 1990 here hasn't managed to last its 4 years in office. And compare that, to Belgium, France, Germany, no early elections here.
Just, we've got questions coming in, but just one quick answer too. Would he accept defeat, Orban?
There's a lot of debate about this. Personally, from my knowledge of him, I think he would.
Okay.
Some people on the left, some of the liberal journalists, my colleagues would say, he'll never go quietly. Maybe not all his people would go quietly, but, if you think of him, he's 63 years old. If he were to be defeated, he could have a long holiday and then bounce back. Perhaps he's got another 20 years of active politicking in him, if, of course, he can hold his party together in opposition. That's another issue at all, because if you haven't got the money to pay all those mouths that a political party needs in the modern world, some people say that his party would collapse if he loses, but it's too early to speculate.
John, your question.
Yes, Viktor Orban, you describe him as the master tactician, but the real master tactician across Europe and the person most likely to interfere is Putin. And I wonder how he is going to react to a threat to Viktor Orban, and what is your sense on Russian interference at the moment in Hungary?
Such a good question, because they're interfering in so many elections. What about that?
They are. A couple of days ago, I think it was on Thursday of last week, Putin gave his annual talk at the Valdai summit in Russia, and he praised Orban and made very clear that he would like Orban to win next year. So, there's no questioning which side he believes the Russian bread is buttered there, if that's the right image. I remember the old black bread that I used to eat when I visited Russia. Russian interference, it's one could say again, colleagues of mine say one can already measure Russian influence in this campaign in the way that the anti-Ukrainian, pro-Russian messages are being echoed in the sort of echo chamber of the Hungarian media. The Hungarian government media is very centralized. And so while there is still quite a healthy independent media here, they are starved of finance. They don't get any state advertising revenue, so they're largely dependent on contributions, subscriptions from their readers, which has been going up. But as they're much more, the independent or critical or opposition media are much more typical, of a media in Western countries, say. They're very critical of the opposition as well, and they don't have a single narrative. What Orban's strength is, in terms of putting his messages across, is that he has the ear of the editors of all his media. So literally he issues bullet points every week. And then in terms of Russian influence, often those bullet points happen to be, by accident or on purpose, the same as the bullet points that the Russians would make. Orban's argument in Ukraine is Ukraine has lost the war. And he repeats this, and therefore his people repeat it, and therefore he sort of sets the tone until he comes up with a new bullet point. And therefore all the pro-government media will repeat that point. Whereas I guess Western European leaders might argue that in fact Ukraine has won this war by standing up to and holding at a line beyond the Dnieper River the might of the Russian army, and a country 4 times bigger than Ukraine. So one could argue like that. But of course, that, when Orban says, Ukraine has lost the war, that's music to Putin's ears. And also on a cultural level, Orban talks about the decline of the West. Just as Putin does. Orban attacks LGBTQ narratives, gender narratives, as undermining the traditional family, undermining the fabric of Western societies. Again, Putin does the same. So in the cultural wars, in the political wars, in the military wars, there's a lot similar to them. So is that Russian influence? I don't know. It's certainly, they're echoing one another, and again, of course, Orban is still buying Russian oil and gas and making being mealy-mouthed about EU sanctions.
Just again, quickly, am I right in thinking when he says Ukraine has lost the war, he's not saying, I hope Ukraine loses the war. He's being this sort of ultra-realist, saying, look, we've got to face the facts. Ukraine's lost. Get used to it.
Exactly. And every day, and he says, for example, he accuses EU leaders of being pro-war. He says that by pouring weapons into Ukraine, prolonging the agony, really, and that had they done a deal back in April 2022, in the early days, hundreds of thousands of lives could have been saved without any difference, really, in territory on the ground. So it's a waste of lives, he says. Of
young lives. Sheila, your question.
I just wondered if you could tell us a bit more about Peter I don't know how to pronounce the name, Magyar's background.
His background. This is interesting because he came from the Fidesz camp. He was a diplomat in Brussels. He was married for 17 years to Judith Varga, who was Orban's justice minister for some of those past years. So he was someone who would be seen at cocktail parties with Fidesz bigwigs, who was living in Brussels, was representing Hungary in Brussels, and he So he's very much a figure from the centre right. He says now that he was sort of biting his lip and not, and trying not to criticise people at that time because it would have embarrassed his wife, who was then Justice Minister. So basically, he emerged in February 2024 at a time of a crisis provoked by the pardoning of the deputy director of a children's home who had was involved in the cover-up of a pedophile scandal, and that scandal, because his wife, as Justice Minister, had signed the documents for the presidential pardon to get this guy out of prison. This was very embarrassing for a government which talks about protecting children, has really put that as the sort of priority of its pro-family policy. So that's where Peter Magyar came from. But he didn't emerge, as a fully fledged politician. He came out really as a critical voice. And initially, he didn't even say, he even denied he wanted to form his own party, but he was kind of forced by circumstance to create a party. Can you trust him? Coming from the Orban camp, I think. I've been watching him closely, meeting him occasionally during the last 18 months or so. I think he's sort of making it up as he goes along, if you like. Like any politician, he's quick on the ball. And he didn't want to be a politician. This wasn't a driving ambition, I don't think, as it was for Orban. But I think he's actually enjoying the battle of it, and he's really come a long way as a politician. Can he assemble a team, though? Because he's got no experience in government, even in local government. Could he? He's shunned the rest of the old opposition. He can't just cherry pick from the old opposition here. They're pretty discredited after 15 years of failing to fight Orban. So in a way, he's got to not only reinvent or invent himself as an opposition leader and then perhaps as a prime minister, he has to gather in a very short period of time a team strong enough to run the economy, to propose legislative change, to perhaps dismantle the house that Victor has built.
And just sort of summarising what you're saying, I think if I've got it right, they both started off in Fidesz, so they were both anti-communist liberals, and they started out together. And then he went, Orban went to let's say the far right, very controversial, difficult term, but it covers some of what he's thinking. And whereas Magyar has moved to the centre right, I mean, that's where we are, and the left is nowhere.
They didn't start at the same time, once you
was younger.
20-year difference, right? Remember, Peter Magyar is 43, Orban is 63. So, so Peter Magyar he didn't start from a liberal position. He sort of emerged out of what was then the centre-right.
I see.
And then hasn't gone with Orban further to the right, but has tried to stay in that dodgy area in Hungarian politics, which some would say doesn't even exist, which is the centre or the centre-right. I remember someone saying to me once, all this country ever needed was a normal Conservative party in power.
When did you last meet Orban?
2 years ago, down at the Ukrainian border. We just bumped into each other there, but we still have good personal relations. I go to his press conferences. He always, we're on first name terms in press conferences. I think he's still a very charismatic politician. He likes shaking hands with people. He likes, being liked. He likes to be liked, and he even to be liked by me, though he won't give me he doesn't give me an interview anymore.
No interviews?
No interviews. Perhaps if he loses the election, he might be knocking on my door.
Yes, that's right. That's often what happens. Once they're out of power, they're very friendly again. And wasn't there a cafe incident?
There was a cafe incident. It was a Sunday morning. I'd taken my kids tobogganing up on the hill above Budapest. It was a sort of cold Sunday morning in February, and my wife and I had gone into a local cafe. But while the kids were tobogganing, we were sitting, having a coffee and a bun in a rather smart cafe up on the hill. And my wife says to me, "Oh, you won't guess who's just come in." And I said, "Yeah, I say you're joking. My back is to him because, we wanted a quiet family morning and she's fed up with me dealing with politics all the time and bringing politics home." And so I, of course, I leap to my feet and go over and shake hands with him and "How are you, Victor?" and so on. And, I can't remember the rest of the encounter, but there are different details of it, but he'd escaped from his family. He lives near there, and he'd gone there to read national sport. He's still a keen football and sportsman or follower of sport, and he'd gone there for a quiet time, I think, to get away from his family on a Sunday. Read the newspapers, and the last thing he wanted was an idiot BBC correspondent, harassing him at his table and asking him what he wants.
Okay, I think that is very interesting. And you've got this tour coming up. Obviously, it will be fascinating, quite important for Europe. And I think you've covered it all brilliantly. So thank you. You really do have such incredible access there.